So yes, good morning, everybody. So Damis has introduced the title. I hope you're all in the right place. I think that this isn't a sit-back presentation. I'd ask you to sit forward, to listen in, to question, to challenge, to ask questions, not least because I think we all have roles to play in helping resolve the polycrisis. It's got implications for every single one of us. And I think at the very least, what we can do is communicate. We can think about our own understanding of what's happening, but also think about how we communicate to others. So in terms of me, just to add to what Damon said about myself, just a couple of things. So yes, I spent most of my career thinking about big business and about profitability and about growth. It was only 2015, 2016 when I started to get into the Sustainable Development Goals, into the Paris Agreement was signed in 2016. And so it was a very heady time, a very exciting time for sustainability. And that's when I started getting into sustainability and thinking about the purpose of big business. I worked for Deloitte. I left at Deloitte in 2021. And by the time I left, I had really come to the conclusion that it was extraordinarily difficult for any big business in the current system to be truly sustainable. In fact, not just difficult, impossible. And there were no good examples. And so that left me to reflect that actually it was the system which was keeping big business unsustainable, i.e. if you had to succeed as a big business, if you had to grow and you had to pursue that path of increased profitability and cash flow leading to better share price, it was inevitable that you weren't going to be sustainable. And so I left Deloitte and I've been working in a variety of different capacities. But most of what I do is trying to reflect on the system change required to deliver against the polycrisis, which would allow, if that system changes sufficiently, it would allow business and organizations to contribute to the thriving and the prospering of us all. So that's really what I'm about. And I work for an organization called Business Declares. So enough of that. This slide I love. I always put it in because I think we do have to fight for a better tomorrow, and we have to do that now. It's not something we need to think about and then sort of reflect on and spend years wondering how we're going to contribute. Everybody needs to step up now, and we need to do that to ensure that our tomorrows and our children's tomorrows and our next generation's tomorrows are at least as good as the today that we have at the moment. So something happened last week, which I think was quite profound for the UK. There was something called the National Emergency Briefing. So this was a large meeting. So about 1,200 people packed out Westminster Hall, just down the road from Westminster itself. And it was called the National Emergency Briefing. There were 10 experts, true experts, speaking about the climate and the nature crisis and its implications for security, for health, of course, driving in through climate and nature as well in itself. And the idea and the importance of this was really to invite as many influential people and particular members of parliament into that setting to hear from the experts over an hour and a half. So it was really well choreographed. It was really well set up. The experts were true experts. And please do seek that out. Have a look online. There's a summary video, 30 minutes. There's a long form of about 1 hour 40. But it is a hugely important synopsis of the science on this topic, up to date and listened to and heard by many, many members of parliament and other business leaders and organizational leaders, etc. So I do encourage you to have a look at that. And I've just taken 3 quotes from that, which I think frame what I'm going to say nicely. So Chris Packham introduced it. So Mike Berners-Lee was the chair, so brother of Tim Berners-Lee. Chris Packham did a tremendous sort of introduction to the topic. And his sort of parallel, or part of his sort of parallel metaphor for what's happening, was the COVID inquiry. And so the COVID inquiry, one of the sort of most shocking or key findings there was that many, many people lost their lives because the science wasn't listened to. And in his words, it wasn't taken seriously enough. It was heard, it was talked about, people kept talking about that refrain of listen to the science, but it wasn't taken seriously enough. And so there were decisions made on other bases, like economic basis, like the dine-out scheme, etc., which significant numbers of lives were lost because the science was not taken seriously enough. So he's creating parallels to the climate and nature crisis. The science is there. The science tells us what's happening, but we're just not listening or not taking it seriously enough. So then Professor Kevin Anderson, who was driving on the climate topic, One of the most, I guess, shocking wake-up calls, if you like, one of the phrases that he used is that it is too late now for non-radical futures. There is no way that we can see a sort of steady little, linear progression from where we are, or stable, steady state where we, chop away at emissions on one side and everything sorts itself out on the other. It's too late for that. And it's not just sort of too late for us to react to something in order to constrain it. So us to sort of think very radically about reducing emissions. It's sort of any scenario is going to be radical. So if we don't do enough, it's going to be radical because we will feel the impact of climate change. If we do tackle it with the speed and the power and the strength that we need to, it's going to fundamentally change what we do and how we act. So that's his point. We face a radical future, inevitably. And then Professor Natalie Seddon, so she was focusing on nature. So she made that sort of the broader generic point about the system change required. And she encapsulated it as I've written there. So we need to reframe the system to incentivize custodianship. So we need to look after what we have. We need to look after each other. We need to look after the environment. We need to put that first and foremost. And the counter to that is what's happening at the moment, where we see exploitation is incentivized. We see externalities not costed into that exploitation. And so she's saying, look at the current system, look at the challenges the current system presents, and actually we need to reframe that fundamentally. So yes, business or organizations can still operate, but they operate on a different basis and incentivized to operate in a way that contributes to our future as opposed to destructs it. So I thought I'd bring that up. It was a really good session. It's really well worth looking at the content. Lots on LinkedIn about it. But I think it is fair to say that probably, a lot of us are in the bubble, congratulating each other, liking, sharing, etc. And it doesn't get out of that bubble. So help us get out of that bubble. Help us take some of those posts, that summary, those videos, help that get outside of the bubble so more people can understand it. It's accessible, well put together, thoroughly recommended. So what I'd like to talk about today is this sort of idea that it's time for change now. I want to touch on the polycrisis a little bit. In terms of the polycrisis, I talk about three different parts of that. So climate, biodiversity, and inequality. You could add more things. So you may have already been introduced today, or you may know all about the planetary boundaries. There are many more planetary boundaries, but I focus on those three. The second thing I want to talk about, that middle column, is really the fact that we prioritize something other than those crises at the moment, at a governmental level, at a corporate or private organization level, and even as citizens and individuals. So we have this crisis, but we're not focusing on it. We're focusing on something else. And the third point is that the implications of this are sort of profound. And it's a bit like the Kevin Anderson thing about the radical futures. And what I want to talk about is I think a vision of what that radical future might look like. But component parts of that is not just sort of us selecting or choosing. Some parts of that are inevitable in some shape or form. So we're going to talk about that. So off we go. So just in terms of that polycrisis, so many of you will know a lot about climate change. So just touch on that in my own words. We know and we understand why the climate is changing, why we have global warming. We've tracked that. We understand that it's the burning of fossil fuels, primarily the burning of fossil fuels, creating greenhouse gases and primarily CO2, so carbon dioxide. So this graph shows that average temperature going up since the sort of beginning of the Industrial Revolution, as we typically sort of base this. And we see that temperature initially sort of below the average and gradually increasing to the red bits and the bars, increasing very steeply now to where we are at the moment. And tracking that is that line of carbon dioxide, and that's measured in parts per million. And so we see that close correlation. It's sort of scientifically evidenced, and it has been for decades. We understand and we know that. And yet, amazingly, not only does this continue to play out, but it's playing out sort of so graphically. And so last year was the hottest year ever recorded. We probably know that. This year is likely to be the second or third hottest year ever recorded. we know the implications of that. We know the implications on weather extremes. We see it in the papers all the time. We may even, feel that at home as well through whatever it might be, flooding, etc. And so we feel the impacts. We know why it's there, and yet we have the highest level of greenhouse gas on record at the moment. So despite the Conference of the Parties, the COP that's just happened in Belém, despite this being understood for decades, we have the highest level of greenhouse gas on record. It's staggering to think how that might even be happening, or why, or how it occurs. And the final thing I've got on that slide is really to think that this is unfortunately a stock, not a flow issue. And by that I mean there is an amount of greenhouse gas and CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 on average might dissipate over 100 years. So it's in the atmosphere having its warming effect. So if we constrain the amount of emissions, and those emissions actually don't grow anymore, so they stay at the current level but they don't grow, we're still adding to that stock. Even if it starts coming down and we start reducing the amount of emissions, it's still adding to the stock. And that happens until you get down to very low levels where the amount dissipated previously is being less than replaced by the amount that's being emitted at the moment. And so we've really got to bring it down rapidly, significantly, and then we've got to take greenhouse gas or CO2 out of the atmosphere as well in order to be safe and to bring temperatures to where they are at the moment, or even reduce them. So we are a long way away from that, obviously, at the moment. We are heading the wrong direction. Those temperatures are getting hotter. So this is, obviously, you can't read this, but this is something we've been doing with PMI. So myself and Stuart Thorpe, who you may have heard earlier, have been running something called Climate Fresk, a workshop, a 3-hour workshop. We've been running that for PMI members for a couple of years. And the reason I've got it here is because it's for twofold. One, we have a really well-established understanding of both, on the left-hand side, sort of what has caused this in terms of the sectors, the sectoral combination and contribution. We then understand the mechanism that sort of, it goes from the different sectors to the fossil fuels to the emissions to the global warming. All of that is well understood and tracked out. And in the workshop, we do that in great detail. And then we know how that then impacts the weather system, the melting of the ice, the rising of the sea levels. And when we understand the implication and impacts on our society through, for instance, agricultural yields, through zoonotic disease, and then we end up on the far right, the very, very specific and direct implications for us in terms of health, in terms of food and famine, in terms of migration, for instance. And so I'm really putting this there to say that, that system, that interaction, that interdependency is well understood. It's quite complicated as you look at it now, but you can sort of break that down over a period of time, hour and a half. There's lots of science to support it. And it's really got super profound implications. That far right bit, where we talk about the war and the migration, both within countries and between countries, has profound implications on all of our societies, on the politics, on where we go next. So that's that. Now, we've just had the COP at Belém. The idea of the Conference of the Parties is that you get all the UN participating countries together. It's the 30th COP, so it's the 31st year, because we missed one during COVID. So the 31st year that all the UN participating countries have actually come together to talk about climate change, to say what is it that we can do to prevent global warming, and then to adapt to the most challenging implications from that warming. You've probably seen lots of summaries, or you may have seen summaries, you may have seen commentary on it. And amazingly, in the text at the end of the session, fossil fuels weren't mentioned. They were taken out of the text. So the idea that we're going to stop using fossil fuels, or we're going to try and transition away from them, which was talked about at the last COP, was not in the text explicitly, or not updated in the text this year. So it just gives you an indication of the political, the lack of cohesion. And you do have to have a consensus at COP for the text to get signed off. It shows the lack of cohesion in terms of seeking to address this. And it's not surprising that it was the petrostates which fought against that. So if you're a small island state, and your your nation state is actually sinking, and people are already climate refugees, obviously you're going to fight all you can to address this crisis, which means getting rid of stopping fossil fuels and transitioning quickly. If it's petro state, then unfortunately they're digging in and saying, no, this is our economy, this is what we do, and so we're not going to sign that. So anyway, it just gives you a little flavor of what's going on there. And then the thermometer shows where we think we are given the commitments. So each of the member states, so 197 countries, UN member states, were supposed to submit prior to this COP a nationally determined contribution. So this is sort of updated plan for 2035, and we only got 120 countries to do that, and that only represented 74% of greenhouse gas worldwide. So I mean, it's the majority, but it's still disappointing. And perhaps even more disappointing, if you go over to the chart on the left-hand side, this says there's a 50% chance that those plans deliver a 2.6% increase in global warming, a massive increase from before pre-industrial levels. We're now at about 1.4, 1.5. That was what we were supposed to keep it to, according to the Paris Agreement in 2016. We've overshot that. It's gone, right? Many scientists say that's disappeared. So we've now got to prepare for higher temperatures. So that purple bit says 50% takes us to 2.6. And there's an 85% chance, there's a 15% chance that it goes to the top end of that purple bar. And then there's a 85% chance that we at least get to the bottom end of that purple bar. So we're seeing very significant increases. And the best and most optimistic scenario there is if we put together all the net zero, the country net zero plans and commitments, which might take us down to just below a 50% chance of just below 2 degrees. Anyway, stand back from it. The point is that even the national plans and contributions, even if they're executed effectively, take us well beyond where we are at the moment. And just on the bottom right there, people talk about tipping points. So there's about 9 identified tipping points. So melting of glacial ice and the AMOC, the antimeridional overturning circulation, basically the Gulf Stream. So there's a variety of different tipping points that are saying that if those natural phenomena which regulate our weather system, if they start, they've already started changing, but if they change too much, those become tipping points, which effectively tips us backwards over the back of our chair. And so those tipping points are being observed. They're very difficult to model, but typically they push us in the wrong direction, not the right direction. And when I said the scorpion there in the note, it's just really thinking about long tail risk. There are very significant long tail risks. That's what actuaries think about. The climate scientists tend to represent things in terms of medians or averages. But the actuaries would say, no, you've got to look at something as important as this. You've got to look at the big challenges, which might have a relatively low probability. So they would look at this differently, and they would say this is a very sort of benign representation of what might happen. So that's climate change. Now, when we get to biodiversity, the second part of the polycrisis, probably the best way of showing this is the Living Planet Index. It's a fantastic index. It's produced by the WWF with partners. And it tracks about 5,000 species across 50,000 populations, and it carries out sort of counting, and it tries to evaluate what's happening to those 5,000 species across 50,000 populations. And the conclusions there was to date, and it's about to 2024 actually, we've seen about a 73% decrease in biodiversity. So a very significant decrease in diversity. And they've also sought to evaluate the reasons for that. And they've done that regionally. So on the right-hand side, as an example, they've got, I've put Africa there. And the biggest, the thing creating the biggest challenge to biodiversity is land use change. Now, it's not climate change, but climate change is in there. And of course, as climate change picks up and gets worse, lo and behold, it's going to have a bigger impact on biodiversity. And this is just sort of one way, I guess, of thinking about the land use change and why that is there. Of course, some of the land use changes because people build on it and live there, etc. But by far and away, the biggest reason for land use change is agriculture and our food system. And just as an indication, so before we were around, at the very top, you see the little sort of turquoise or cyan or whatever bar, which talks about wildlife, wild mammals. We see that decreasing, one below it, and then sort of humans turn up, and we see that shared then between wildlife, between humans, and between livestock. And then to today, or not quite to today, but recently, we see this enormous increase of the human footprint or the biomass. We see enormous increase in livestock there to feed us, or to by choice. And then we see a massive compression of basically the biomass of wildlife mammals. So when we talk about land use change, this is the basis. This is why we've got that land use change. And of course, the biodiversity piece is, this isn't just about nice things or walking, having access to the outdoors. We know that, of course we know that. There are various estimates about the amount of direct dependency on nature and biodiversity of our GDP, for instance. And numbers are around 55% of GDP is directly implicated by biodiversity. But also, nature is there and biodiversity there is to regulate and to help us manage and handle the carbon storage that we need to manage the emissions that we're making. It's there as well to help us, for instance, flood, to adapt. And so when we talk about flood control or coastal protection, it's the erosion of nature and biodiversity loss which is making that worse. And conversely, there's nature-based solutions which could address those and make those better. And of course, pretty much anything we're fundamentally dependent on, be that food or water, the air that we breathe, etc., is contributed to, if not fundamentally established on a strong and healthy natural environment. So when that goes, lots of other things go with it, including us. And so unfortunately, the outlook, rather like the emissions at the moment, the outlook, if we continue to do exactly what we're doing, if we continue with that sort of land use degradation, the increase in climate change, etc., it's only going to get worse and significantly worse. But the good news is that we do actually understand what's driving it and how we might address it. And I think there's another piece of good news, which is I think there is greater understanding between the intersectional issues of this and of, for instance, climate change. So, which is a great thing. So just moving on then to the third point in the polycrisis, which is inequalities. So you might have seen these charts. It's a great report. Oxfam do a good job around inequality, by the way, but so does this report. And if you look at these two charts, the one on the left-hand side, you may not be able to read it fully, but it's the main industrialized economies, with a couple of exceptions. And what we see there is, over a significant period of time, we see the accretion of wealth moving from the public sector to the private sector. So basically, the private sector has pretty steadily got richer in every single economy, and the public sector has pretty steadily in every economy become indebted. So there's been a huge transfer of wealth from one to the other. Now, if that private wealth was then shared equitably, whatever that means, then you might say, well, that's not such a bad thing. I can live with that, and I don't really, maybe as an individual and in terms of fairness, maybe it doesn't really matter. But unfortunately, and of course that we know this, it's not shared equitably. So we go on to the right-hand side, and we see that, again, over an extended period of time, we've seen huge increases in the size of the global economy. But if you look at the bottom 50% of people in the world, they have accrued just 3% of that growth, just 3%. And we look at the far right, and conversely, we see 30% plus accrued to the top 1%. And if you look at the very wealthy, you see an almost exponential increase in the extent to which they have become more wealthy. And so what we're seeing is this transfer from public to private, and then within private, a transfer from the poorest to the richest. And that is ongoing. Now, this is from the US, slightly different way of looking at it. So the US, arguably the sort of front runner in terms of extreme capitalism. You look at the bottom 40% of the population, what happened to them between 83 and 2019? They actually went backwards in terms of household wealth, backwards. If you look at the top 1%, you can see there, I don't know, I can't quite read it, but it's probably tripled. If you look at the top 1%, 0.1%, very, very significant in absolute. So in terms of proportion, maybe slightly less than the top 1%. In terms of absolute, absolutely huge increase. So it's just another way of talking about the way that the system is working in terms of both the generation, not really the generation, sorry, the distribution and the access to that wealth. It's got very, very significant implications, that inequality. So what this does, excuse me, is show in the UK the difference in quality life years, life expectancy for males across different local authorities. And we see a huge difference between the ones at the far right and the ones at the top left. A massive difference driven by demography, driven by inequality. And that, even within a local authority, there's a whole range. So you could actually choose different dimensions to show an even starker difference between those well off doing well and those less well off. So it's got real term implications. Now, I don't know, there's an economist called Gary Stevenson, who used to be a trader. He's like the people's economist. You may or may not listen to him. Look him up if you don't. Super interesting. And he leads on sort of a tax the rich type agenda. And the reason he does that, in part, not because he thinks it's fair, because he sees that at the moment, a small number of the population, both in the UK and globally, are increasing their wealth rapidly, far more rapidly than GDP. And so his point is like, well, that's not sustainable, because you are effectively creating that transfer of wealth from the other part of the population to yourselves. And if you are consistently growing and you add to that a sort of compound rate of growth, where does it end? You will run out of population and wealth to exploit. It will implode in itself, per se, anyway. And so he talks about it from that perspective. You could look at it from the human cost perspective, but any which way, we have a system at the moment which is driving inequality harder and faster and creating unsustainable outcomes. So donut economics, so there's somebody called Kate Raworth, great economist / professor, and they have a big organization now around the donut, as it's called, which is this representation of what we should think about when we think about the economy. And there's something called DEAL, so the Donut Economics Action Lab, which is for organizations. If you don't know that, again, well worth looking up. And this talks about using this type of mindset to think about an economy. And so what she says is we should try and live in the green bit, in which she calls the donut. And the green bit is basically the space where we are not exceeding the planetary boundaries. So we're living in the carrying capacity of the Earth. So emissions, for instance, we take that all the way down to a level at which we can manage it, as an example. So climate change is manageable. But the inner bit is that we are also serving the needs of the population that we have. And unfortunately, the red bits show the overshoot and the undershoot. So basically, we are overshooting on many of the planetary boundaries, and we are undershooting on many of the basic human needs in the middle. So her point is we've got to serve the needs better, and we've got to come back in within the planetary boundaries. So there's a lot behind that, but I think in terms of representation, it's a good one. So I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to sort of whip on quite quickly. Thank you for the question, by the way, Karen, and we'll come to that in a minute. So the next bit then is, okay, so we've done the polycrisis, so, but it's not changing. Why isn't it changing? So one of the reasons it's not changing is that we are focusing on something else, and we focus on economic growth. So the global institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, they all talk about economic growth. They talk about sustainable economic growth, but they still talk about sustainable growth. All the big economies, so the leaders and the leading parties of all the big economies also have growth right at their hearts, including the UK for Labour, even a Labour government who thinks that economic growth is the biggest mission, number one mission of the government. So they're focusing on economic growth. They're not talking primarily about the crisis that we've just talked about. They're talking about economic growth. And why do they do that? Because there's this sort of, should we call it an economic, this norm of talking about growth and expecting people to imagine that they're going to benefit from that. They're not benefiting from it, many of them. But the concept is, oh yeah, we'll all get better, and we'll all have fantastic jobs and get better. Unfortunately, that's not the case. That's not true. The IMF itself has got a rich study around, trickle down economics. It doesn't deliver, but it's a very, very, very shall we say, embedded norm. And one of the reasons for that is the amount of debt. So debt has increased massively. Public debt has increased massively. And when you think about Liz Truss in the UK, she tripped up, she triggered a sort of increase in the cost of borrowing through the bond market. And so that public debt is a very important thing to observe. It's a key factor in our stability, and we've got to keep an eye on it. It's not obviously just governments, it's also companies. So we look at the companies and we say, oh, well, companies, particularly public companies, every single one talks about growth. Every single one as the most important thing, growth in profitability or revenue growth or volume growth. So, and one of the reasons for that is this sort of transactional relationship between the shareholders and the company. So maybe back in the day, you had longer tenure of shareholders. You had people who thought and cared about the businesses they invested in. They may even live in the local community. Now, of course, that's all gone. This is all done through multiple sort of, the investor, the person with the money is very often completely abstracted from where the investment goes. They've got no idea where it is. They just want to see an increase in money, and they want a short-term increase in money. That creates the pressures, that puts it on the business. It's not an excuse, it's just an observation. That then creates this sort of short-term growth mentality. And it becomes cultural, and it becomes something which you find in pretty much every business. So it's an issue. And then even at our level, a citizen level, people level, the cost of living we see go up. We see the financialization that's happening across our economy. And then we need money to actually deliver that. It might be childcare, it might be, education, it might be anything else, but we see that cost of living going up. So then we want more. So unfortunately, we're in that cycle of need and economic growth. So, and it's deeply entrenched. It's very difficult to get rid of. And just one example from that, we don't have time to go for more. One example of that is the number of lobbyists at COP. 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists were there to keep the existing system intact and make sure nothing was rocked. So unfortunately, that sort of economic hegemony, that understanding of the existing system is out and about and deeply embedded. So economic growth, is it a good thing or bad thing? Well, at the moment, it's not a good thing. It's not what we want. It doesn't think about inequality. It profits effectively, or it's sort of it's positive when we have a disaster. So, for instance, if you rebuild an economy, if we see Gaza being rebuilt, that's going to contribute to GDP growth. So it's a nonsense. Yeah, it excludes unpaid work. It doesn't account for environmental damage in any shape or form. And it certainly doesn't measure the quality of life. So it's not what we need. And yes, it's talked about incessantly. That growth, it's not only, though, a sort of diversion, but actually it's directly related to material usage, which is what this chart shows, is directly related to emissions as well. So we see some decoupling between growth and energy usage and emissions. And we see a little bit of decoupling because of efficiencies, but also because of renewables and the renewables transition, but it is insufficient. And so, yes, we do see, unfortunately, that economic growth driving up not just material extraction, but also energy use and emissions. And then the final point on growth is it's becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. In the UK, we have been talking about productivity forever. We can't really drive productivity up. We can only grow, therefore, if you have more workers. We've got a political issue with that. And so growth is disappearing. Growth is inevitably disappearing for lots of other reasons, like demographics, let alone climate change. If you layer in climate change, it's even more challenged. So it's not something which is a sensible thing to go for anyway. So we need to find an alternative. And to be honest, we don't need huge amounts of GDP to do well. You look at this chart on the right-hand side, it shows the GDP per capita. On the x-axis, it shows GDP per capita. And on the y-axis, you have a social progress index, which is an index of all those things that we want, like, security and freedom and etc., right? And good education. And this shows that actually as GDP per capita increases, the increase in social progress tails off. And there are many good examples of countries with a very low GDP per capita, for instance, Costa Rica, which do very well in terms of social progress. So we do have much to learn from around the world just by looking at this chart. It tells us don't overly focus on GDP.
Stuart, to interject quickly, we have 5 minutes more for the session.
Okay.
Yeah.
So give us, two seconds to wrap up. So to get to the next stage. So basically what I'm saying then is the current economic system is holding us in the spine, right? So we then get to the next bit in terms of a solution. And the solution has got to have a number of different parts, yeah? And they will happen anyway to some greater or lesser extent. And the bottom left is we need to reduce the amount of industrial activity that we have in some shape or form. There is too much stuff being produced. There's too much exploitation. That leads too much emissions. So that needs to be reduced. And when we think about what we could reduce, we could just look around our own homes and see what's needed and what isn't needed. We've got a huge amount of stuff which isn't needed. Those things which aren't needed need to go. We can't afford them. We need to focus on something other than GDP and economic growth. And so we need to focus on a well-being economy or prosperity or some other word that you would have heard to describe those many other aspects of life which aren't necessarily financialized. Yeah, which don't necessarily lead to material exploitation or emissions. We want to do this in a way that's equitable and just. Yeah, super important, because that injustice and that inequality is not only a moral abhorrence, but it actually puts us in the wrong place as well. And across the bottom, we need to do this in a way that is democratic. We don't want dictatorships. We want to democratize production. We want to democratize how we shape our economy and how we shape our world going forward. And not only will we get to better outcomes that way for more people, but it's going to be more sustainable as well. So those are the component parts of what we're talking about. If you talk about a business, basically that means thinking about your product, which genuinely serves a human need and genuinely reduces pollution. So just stripping right to the end, people, and we'll distribute the slides afterwards, right to the end, in terms of project management. So what I ask for you is establish your own version of this worldview. Have your own view. There's lots of information out there. This is a framework that you can use to sort of construct that worldview. Have your own opinion about what's going to happen. Because if you don't believe in climate change, you don't believe we've got a crisis, then you're going to take a different path. The second thing is, please consider your client, your project, your development choices against that worldview. Try and align, try and be consistent. I know, everybody has mouths to feed, etc., but try and be consistent with that view. And don't do it just because of sort of morality or anything else, or wanting to contribute to addressing these big challenges. Do it because it gives your career resilience. So in 10 years' time, when you look back at the choices you're making now, you can be proud of them and you can explain them to people. Instead of somebody going, "Why did you work for?" You can say, "Yeah, I worked for them and did that project because I saw an alignment between that and how I understood the world at the time." The fourth bit is then think about the skills required, the new skills. So you've just listened to Stuart, I think, talking about, for instance, the carbon value, time value of carbon. So super important as a concept and as a tool. So there are many, many different tools and understandings. We don't have to all be experts at everything, but be across those and take opportunities to learn and develop. And the final thing is immerse yourself in communities. And those might be local communities, there might be the PMI, there might be other communities of learning and understanding, where people are trying to sense make. And I've got a few of those communities myself. I find them incredibly useful. You can take questions there. How do I square the circle? Please help me. And people are willing and happy to help. Nobody's got all the answers. There's lots of people offering help. So do that and immerse yourself. So sorry, I've gone on a bit, but so Damith, should we just look at these two questions?
Yeah, we have one question from Karen. How do we shift from a problem-solving mindset to a mindset that is based on relational intelligence, relationships with each other and our environment that may just lead to understanding and motivation sufficient to actually change what we do?
Okay, it's a lovely question. And I think I don't have a full answer, of course I don't, but just a couple of bits and pieces, right? So one would be, I think we lose that any sense of relationship, for instance, when we are far from the actions and impact are far apart. So that point about sort of shareholders, there's a huge difference, a huge gap between somebody with the money investing and what actually happens on the ground. That's the opposite of relational. So in order to bring that closer, we need to think about, for instance, different forms of ownership. And so, for instance, employee ownership, I think you've got a better chance of sort of putting relationships at the heart of this in some shape or form. I think in addition to that, most sort of people thinking about a better future think about community, substantially increased and enhanced community-based, community-based activity and economic activity and social interaction. So once again, that's another way, I guess, of saying putting relationship at the bottom. So sorry, at the center of this, which I think would help enormously.
Yeah, Sam, I think we've run out of time. We need to move into the next session. But to the attendees, Sam will be available on the networking session, so you can reach out to him, and we will anyway.
Yeah, and Damith, just to interject, sorry, very quickly, Jack Adams. Yeah. Should the core of project management refocus on solving problems rather than pretending that endless growth is our core aim? Absolutely. And I would just add to that we've got to be careful that we're not, addressing short-term problems, which ultimately create long-term challenges. So I'll just add to that. But the answer is yes. We should not pretend that endless growth is our core aim. It shouldn't be, and it can't be.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks a lot for this session. It was very thought-provoking. I hope you and everyone else joins the other sessions as well. I think there's a lot to learn and listen today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Damith. Thank you, everybody.